Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of Kuiper Labs. In today's video we're going to go through the concepts involved in the water cycle. Okay, so far in the topic we've been looking at renewable and non-renewable resources, classifying the things that we use based on how quickly they are able to be replaced or how likely they are to run out. And so one of the types of renewable resources that we've been looking at is water. And so the reason that we call it renewable is that the water that we have access to, the fresh water that we're able to drink and we use for washing and cleaning and cooking and all those sorts of things, is something that is continually being recycled on the planet. And so we're going to talk through some of the concepts involved, or remind ourselves of some of the concepts involved in the water cycle. So I'm going to be working with this diagram that we're establishing here. So I want you to make sure that you're drawing that in your books, and then we're going to leave plenty of space because we're going to add various details as we go through the video. Okay. So hopefully you can kind of get a bit of a sense of what this is supposed to be to start with. Okay, so we've got the land over here, and then we've got the ocean over here. Okay, and I've even done some pretty color coding for you, so nice and blue for the ocean. Okay, so when we're thinking about the water cycle, there's two kind of key sort of terms that we're gonna use. We're going to use the term reservoir, and we're going to use the term flux. Okay, so two kind of scientific terms involved here. Okay, and so a reservoir is where water is stored. Okay, so within the hydrosphere, the area of the Earth that we consider as part of this involving water, that we're saying that the water is stored in certain places, so we call it a reservoir. Okay, we also use this word specifically to think about a place where fresh water can be stored for drinking as well, but it doesn't just have to relate to that. And then a flux. Well, we use this word flux to think about the transfer process. So how does water get from point A to point B? What's the process involved in actually in that water kind of moving from reservoir to reservoir? Okay, so make sure you write that down. I'm going to rub it off from here just because I'm going to need this space on my diagram. So whether you want to make sure that it's kind of off to the side or you just kind of work around it, it's up to you. Okay, so what we have over here is, so we've got plenty of water stored in the oceans on the Earth. That water over here is not fresh water that we can drink. You can't just kind of get a bucket of seawater and take it back to your house and kind of have a nice drink. It's far too salty. Okay, so it's not fresh water, it's salt water. Okay, but what happens is that we have this wonderful thing up in the sky that you might be familiar with. Can't see it very much at the moment. Is the sun. Okay, so we have the sun as a source of thermal energy. Okay, that is energy that comes from the sun that heats things up. Okay, it's also a source of visible light, so we can see as well, but here we're talking about the heat involved. So what happens is that the energy from the sun shines down on the ocean, and then what we get is that we get some of that water evaporating. Okay, so this is our first kind of flux. We're talking about evaporation. Okay, this idea that the water actually heats up to become a gas. It makes its way up, further up into the sky, where the water particles kind of start to clump together to make droplets, which kind of hang together high up in the sky to make clouds. Okay, so we get all sorts of different types of clouds forming. You might have learnt that in primary school geography or something like that. But essentially they are collections of water droplets. Because they're so light and so small, and up where they are, the air is a lot less dense than it is down here. They are able to kind of rest up there. Okay, that they're actually, because the droplets are light, they're able to stay where they are up in the atmosphere. But what happens is that these clouds eventually start to move their way across onto land. Now, particularly over here, I'm going to now draw some mountains or high places. Okay, it doesn't have to be mountains, it might be some hills, or it might be a plateau, like the sort of thing that we have near where we live. Okay, but some sort of high point. So what happens is that the clouds form over the ocean and then start to make their way inland. And what happens, so this is our mountain, is that then the clouds move over here. So over to the high place. Now what happens is that as this is happening, that then this that the clouds are getting bigger and heavier. They're also getting much closer to land, or they're closer to areas where it's kind of denser. And what happens is that we get rain, or some form of precipitation, okay, which is our next flux. Okay, so we've got reservoirs in the ocean, pardon me, the clouds, and then we've got fluxes of evaporation and precipitation. Pardon me again. Okay, so that might come down in the form of rain. If it's up particularly high, it might be in the form of snow or hail. Okay, the exact kind of how depends on lots of kind of weather conditions. Okay, but so that rain, or that water, reaches down to the so we get it going down there, and then it starts to run over the land. Okay, making its way downhill back to the ocean. So we call this runoff, that goes over the land. Okay, and so now also, so what that does is that kind of recycles or brings water back to the ocean. So that the ocean kind of gets topped up again, and the cycle continues. Now we've kind of a couple of other aspects to this cycle that we need to consider. Now, one thing that you may have observed when we have periods of heavy rain around your house is that water kind of builds up in the soil, or builds up kind of on the ground. You get puddles that kind of form, especially if it's rained very heavily or rained a lot over a long period of time. But otherwise, then what happens is that water kind of soaks into the ground. Okay, so some kind of runs off downhill, or around, in our urban areas, kind of runs into drains and kind of out to sea that way. And so what we get is that sometimes then this water actually kind of makes its way through the soil into what we call groundwater. Okay, so groundwater is another reservoir that we experience. Okay, especially in places like in the out kind of west of New South Wales and Queensland and things like that, where they're not very close to the ocean. This source of groundwater is, often what we were talking about is bore water, is their source of drinking water. Okay, they're actually tapping into water that exists under the ground, that's moving its way under the ground, and then is water that they can get to drink. And otherwise, it tastes a bit different to the fresh water that we might drink near the ocean, because it's got a lot of salts and other things like that dissolved in it. But otherwise, it's much more of fresh water than, say, the seawater that we would have. You can't drink the seawater, but you can drink groundwater, even if it tastes a bit tangy on your tongue. And so what we also get is that water moves its way through the ground and then back to the ocean as well. Okay, so that you're getting water that's coming over across the land by runoff. It makes its way into the groundwater, and also that kind of works its way through to the ocean. But now the other thing that we kind of need to factor in here, I'm going to just clean this little bit off just to give myself a bit of space, is that the land is not bare. Okay, what we have is that we have lots of living things, like plants. Okay, and so what happens is that plants absorb water through their roots that goes up into the plant, and then it comes out again. So you might have done this perhaps in Year 7, where you looked at like how water travels up through the structure of a celery plant, and using different colouring. And so then what happens is that then the water actually evaporates from the leaves of the plant, and we call that evapotranspiration. It's a big long word. Transpiration is this idea of water making its way up through the plant, and then the evapo part, like the evaporation over here, is then when it gets to the leaves and it evaporates. It kind of goes from being liquid into being a gas. and goes up into the atmosphere and helps, that join the rest of the water in the atmosphere that makes its way up into clouds. Okay, so you've got water moving its way through the cycle in a range of different processes we call fluxes. Okay, but then the idea is that this is a cycle that will continue. We get the water from the ocean that evaporates, forms the clouds, make their way over to land. We get precipitation, so the rain comes back to Earth. It runs across the land. It runs down, it absorbed down into the soil and into the groundwater. It's also absorbed by living things like plants who use some of it, and then some of it also will evaporate, returning into the atmosphere. The water over here then makes its way back to the ocean, and the cycle continues. Alright, thanks very much for watching. Bye for now.